Well, thanks for joining us on the inaugural edition of Rights and Democracies live at 525. I'm the host for this edition. My name is Traven. And just to share with folks who are not familiar, the mission of Rights and Democracy is to bring people together, to take action to build healthy communities, and make the values of our communities guide the policies of our government. We're building a popular movement to advance rights and build a real democracy. We work in partnership with community groups, progressive unions, faith communities, organizations fighting for human and civil rights, and environmental and climate action groups. We envision a state where every Vermonter earns a livable wage and has access to affordable health care, and where a progressive and equitable tax system supports an economy that protects the environment and human rights. We believe Vermont can lead our country in a new direction towards happy, healthy, and just communities for everyone. And now what we want to focus on in this program, first inaugural edition of Rights and Democracies, live at 525, is our draft framework for jobs, justice, and climate. Obviously burning issues. And we're in the process now of gathering community feedback on what we refer to as 8 buckets that inform. These are actually, we've been running workshops around the state, and we'll continue to do that, where we ask people to brainstorm on the buckets in this agenda. And that's to help us develop a mass movement for legislative and political engagement to inform our candidate engagement and legislative reform fights. We've got a lot to change. These are serious issues given that we're actually confronting a planetary emergency. So there's a moral responsibility for us to take up these issues, a deep urgency, and we have a fierce determination to do so. We're interested in sort of overall framework is we want to promote systemic racial, social, and economic justice and equality in part of the transition towards a sustainable environment. This obviously involves decarbonizing our economy while ensuring livable wages and dignified working conditions for all Vermonters. We're guided by the vision of a desire to create a true democracy which represents and upholds the will of the people rather than the will of corporate interests. And we, of course, are collaborating with and support allies around our region. And in all of this work, we're guided by a number of human rights principles. Our agenda, just to run through it really briefly, is, of course, what we want is a just transition for clean energy jobs, and we'll get into more about what we actually mean by a just transition later. The goal is to keep at least 80% of global fossil fuels in the ground, and that means in Vermont no new fossil fuel infrastructure projects. Part of what we need to do is, one important step is to divest all state funds from fossil fuel portfolios, actually have a carbon tax and a just transition fund that is related to that. And part of a state carbon pollution tax also involves having a dividend program so that it actually funds, provides for a carbon tax that's done in an equitable and progressive fashion, and also funds a jobs trainings program. So part of a just transition to jobs and new economy involves making sure that there are job standards that ensure livable wages and dignified working conditions for everyone, engaging labor unions, and much more. I'm just running through this very briefly. We're going to have a discussion about energy democracy and what we mean about that, but that's an important part of the transition that we project, and that means fighting for policies and funding for communities and cooperatively owned energy projects. Because we have operating in a human rights framework, the rights of disaffected and marginalized communities, that is the most impacted people, the frontline communities, are particularly important. Obviously, clearly, energy conservation and efficiency is a really important part of this overall program, which might involve net zero building codes, credits for energy retrofits for owners and landlords, and a real jobs program for retrofits. We've got to deal with transportation, and there's many ways we can do with that, but we want to introduce the idea of moving towards a 4-day work week. There's got to be public education for this new economy, and much more. So just that's sort of a discussion that we've been having with communities and workshops around the state and want to engage people on a mass level. So I want to introduce our guests. We've got Matthew Burke here in the studio with us. He's a rights and democracy advisor who lives in Charlotte, Vermont, and he's also a doctoral student at McGill University researching energy transitions. Thank you, Matthew, for being here.
Thanks, Traven. Good to be here.
And on via technology here, maybe this is part of our solution to transportation issues, Aly Johnson Kurts, who's on via Skype. She's Rights and Democracy's Communications Director, who's joining us from Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts. Aly, thank you for joining us. So, why don't we actually go right into a discussion with Matthew about, you've written a document, a really interesting discussion document here on energy democracy in Vermont, a renewable energy alternative for people and the planet. Why don't you share with us briefly some of your ideas?
Thanks. So the document that I've drafted in collaboration with others introduces the idea of energy democracy and tries to put it in the context of Vermont. So let me just start by saying what energy democracy is not. Right now, we are deeply connected to and dependent upon a fossil fuel-based energy system. That has huge consequences for people around the world. It has huge consequences for us here, living here in Vermont and the Northeast. And it has huge consequences, as we know, for the planet. So that, as an industry, has great inequity. It has it's one of the most profitable industries in the history of at least, well, yeah, we'll just say that. And massive disparity in income within the industry itself. CEOs of the major fossil fuel companies continue to make enormous profits, even as the prices have dropped. And despite that, you have the climate crisis. You have all along the supply chain, fossil fuel is causing damage and all sorts of problems for local communities at the level of the extraction and all along, as we're going to discuss later, along the supply chain. So that represents a very undemocratic energy system. What we're trying to do through the energy transition, through a focus on a principle like energy democracy, is to really push ourselves to ask, yes, we know due to a climate crisis, we need to shift to renewable energy. And as you just laid out in the Rights and Democracy agenda, we want to get to 100% renewable energy. There's a big question in terms of how we do that. And the energy democracy framework represents one key principle, one organizing principle that can help us, guide fundamentally a different pathway, if you will, towards that renewable energy future. Most recently, it has deep roots, but the energy democracy as a movement has deep roots, but most recently is coming out of the work on climate justice. And it's very much, I see on your button, it very much is about connecting the climate justice and issues of social justice and social equity and democracy and ownership to the need to convert our entire energy system. The time frame that we're talking about, I think, is important because it comes into play in a couple of ways. First, we understand that to avoid catastrophic climate change, we need to really shift away and reduce our fossil fuel consumption within several decades. If actually we probably would have been much better off having done it already. But given this is where we are, we need to make a massive shift of our entire energy system within several decades. However, that's still long enough that we can consider the way we want to do that. And in fact, by broadening the benefits of this new energy system, this emerging energy system, we could actually make it easier to get to those goals. Otherwise, we risk, in our current model, the way we're approaching it, we risk getting gridlocked, getting hung up, getting really stuck in these local issues, pitting environmentalists against each other. I argue in this report.
There's huge pushback in this state against moving towards renewables in some communities. People, I mean, some people call it NIMBYism, but
Right.
people feel they have no control over what's happening, and and it's.
That's it. So the energy democracy is very much about trying to create a different type of conversation and a different way of distributing that power and that decision making around this energy system. In particular, it seeks to, through the energy system, build democratic institutions, democratic systems of decision-making about our energy, and be much more inclusive to groups that are traditionally marginalized or left out of what we've seen so far of a renewable energy system. Basically, I'm arguing
So you're
that,
talking about 90% of the people.
Yeah, and
most people feel they're left out.
I feel like the sort of the real estate development model that is currently leading the way, if you want to think of it that way, is going to be wholly inadequate to get us to our goals and to do it in a way that is most equitable for people.
So how do you empower communities so people don't feel this is just being imposed on them?
Well, we can look at what a lot of other communities have done. So who's doing energy democracy right now? There are a lot of organizations across the U.S. that have really taken this up. Trade Unions for Energy Democracy has really started some of the organization around that, coming out of Cornell in New York. There have been action in Brooklyn, in Boston, in Buffalo, in Oakland, in Colorado, in Cleveland. A number of communities are looking at this and trying to come up with different approaches to doing this. How do you do it? You use a lot of different approaches, and some of those can really build on what Vermont has already done. So we have ways of, we have a feed-in tariff, we have renewable portfolio standards, we have ways of connecting distributed systems to the grid. All those are especially important, access to the grid. How to go further than that, though, is to start to create the decision-making structures that really bring, and the ownership structures that really bring a lot of these decisions over the long term to a community and to a local level.
So there's some kind of public or cooperative community ownership of these, so it's not just out-of-state multinationals that are doing the development of it. Is that?
In some cases, it can involve new business structures like a cooperative. In some cases, it can use some of the systems that are already in place. Vermont Law School has worked with a number of communities to use a limited liability company. And there are some models that we can point to there where communities, groups of people are getting themselves together, they're self-financing it. That doesn't necessarily work for everyone, but a lot of these communities are able to do it. They're self-financing it, then they own the technology, they own the renewable energy credits, they own the electricity that's being produced, and so on. So it's really about making sure more people are getting the benefit of this energy transition over the long term.
Well, obviously this is an issue we're going to have to get into more deeply at another time.
Yeah.
And I imagine we'll actually put this up on RAD's website, Rights and Democracy's website, which is RAD-TV.org. Thanks for that contribution, important discussion.
Absolutely.
And I want to turn now to Aly, and I wanted you to speak in particular about what stakes you think youth have in the climate movement.
Thanks, Matt, for that. I think it's a really nice frame to talk about youth stake in the climate movement, because we're not just talking about whether we'll have a livable planet to live on. We're talking about whether the structures that we build going forward are going to work for all of us, whether they're going to work for young people and people who aren't white. And so that is a just a critical framework to think about how we move into the renewable energy that we need to see. But for young people, especially right now, this is the defining issue of our generation, because we are concerned about our future. Just yesterday in Vermont, floodwaters in Montpelier, came in and people were scared. I was talking with folks who are living in areas that flooded during Hurricane Irene, and it's really concerning about whether or not we as young people, whether our future is going to look like flooding and drought and wildfire in different areas of the country. And so for us, it's really a life or death issue, whether or not we commit to this renewable energy just transition.
Aly, you were involved in let's say, a confrontation with our governor in Paris at the climate conference there. Could you say something about what that was about?
In Paris, Governor Shumlin was invited along with local climate leaders, and I'm going to put that in quotation marks for the moment, because we found out, I was in Paris at the United Nations climate talks to advocate for this just transition, to advocate with other youth. And we found out that Governor Shumlin had been invited to come and speak there on a panel of local climate leaders, and discovered that every one of the panelists supported fossil fuel infrastructure, fossil fuel build out in their state, in their home state. And we said, this is unacceptable. We can't be building more fossil fuel infrastructure at this point. We have to be making the transition. And this, the fracked gas pipeline that Vermonters are so concerned about, is the largest fossil fuel infrastructure build out that Vermont has seen in over 50 years. And so we said, how is it possible that Governor Shumlin is coming to the international stage to get basically an award? He's standing on a stage speaking as the local climate leader, while simultaneously at home pushing fossil fuel infrastructure. It didn't add up. And so we organized, brought together people from each of the states that were represented on that panel, and interrupted them one at a time to say, whatever fossil fuel project you're supporting in your community, that is unacceptable. It's incompatible with climate leadership to be supporting fracked gas, to be supporting new pipelines. And so we're drawing a line in the sand and saying, we need more from our political leaders. Just statements aren't enough anymore. We need a commitment to no new fossil fuel infrastructure. We need a commitment to a just transition. And so that was my motivation, was to call on Vermont's political leaders to step up and be the leader that we know we can be in the renewable energy transition.
So we're dealing with some tough issues here. Let me ask you, right now, divestment is a very polarizing issue, with the governor having proposed to the legislature that they mandate that the pension funds and whatnot be moved out of coal and out of investments in Exxon. What's your take on this divestment issue?
You and I talked earlier just about, with workers' rights. I think that there's a piece to be said about, are we bringing in, all of the stakeholders in these conversations? I think divestment is a powerful tool to send a message to industry that, their business model of continuing to burn fossil fuels past the point where we know that it'll leave us with, a non-livable planet. It's a powerful message to say that that's unacceptable. And at the same time, I think it's a struggle to make sure that's done in a way that acknowledges all of the stakeholders, just like any of these issues that we're talking about. I think in terms of divestment in Vermont, divestment from coal is a no-brainer. Under the Clean Power Plan, coal is on its way out. They're not smart investments anymore. It's good that Vermont is moving away from coal, because it just makes economic sense. And then in terms of ExxonMobil divestment, that sends an incredibly powerful message to one of the most powerful companies in the world, who has a history of workers' rights abuses and inequality within the company, as Matt was talking about earlier. That's incredibly powerful. Exxon lied to the public for years about their knowledge on climate change, and to say, we can't profit off of that. Vermont should not be profiting off of that. It's a powerful message.
It's another issue with the nuclear plant having closed for, quite frankly, for market-driven reasons down in Vernon. There's interest there in the community and some other job creation strategy. They floated the idea of a natural gas plant. What's your take on that sort of issue?
Vernon needs a solution for jobs, and I just, a natural gas plant is not it. It's a problem because it will make pipeline. It's a fossil fuel build out. It'll make pipelines more likely. They're not green jobs. It's not going to be good for the community to continue to build out fossil fuel infrastructure. There's safety hazards that come with that, and I just think that we have an incredible opportunity there to build out, as we mentioned before, good green jobs in the renewable energy sector. And so I hope we don't sacrifice that opportunity and continue to build out fracked gas.
This once again underlines the importance of there is going to be a transition, obviously, and the question whether or not it's a just transition. Is it something that's done in a divisive way that further hurts the living standards and communities of working people and the poor, indigenous communities, or is this going to be done in an equitable way that's based on a human rights perspective? Matt, you probably, I know carbon tax is also an issue that's before us. Any quick thoughts about the carbon tax and how that could or should be done?
Yeah, I've got a couple of thoughts, but let me just to go off of what Aly was just talking about, this being an opportunity. Effectively, this is an opportunity like no other that we've seen. I mean, we have this opportunity to entirely rebuild an energy system. That's a massive project, and it's going to require everybody to be involved. And in a way that we can do that so that these are decentralized systems by nature of the technology, more so than what we've been accustomed to. And they're going to be here with us for a while, but they're also going to take a lot of investment. They're going to take a lot of work to get it there. That's going to require people at all levels of our communities to get involved with this, and that is a huge opportunity, and it's a way, that itself is a way to really get people together and to do this. We absolutely need to keep the fossil fuels in the ground, and we understand that. A carbon tax is a way to do that. It can also be a way to, it's a way for us to work as far up the pipeline as we can here in Vermont, because we're not an extractive state. But it's also a way for us to potentially redistribute or do a tax shift as part of this carbon tax. So it's partly a matter of getting the price right, putting a price on the pollution, then to couple that with other related instruments where you're reducing taxes in other areas that are regressive, for example, an income tax or a sales tax. And then you can also reinvest that. It can be reinvested. It can be repayments to low-income families. It can also be used for weatherization, which is also a more equitable way to deal with this. So carbon tax, I think of that as a design, like you need to think of the whole policy instrument and not just the price on the carbon. Okay.
Well, there's a lot to discuss, and this is why we're holding rights, jobs, justice, and climate workshops all around the state. And any quick comments on that? We have about 2 minutes.
Okay. Well, we had a great workshop. We had a great Rights and Democracy Summit on the 5th of December. Had a really good turnout. We had candidates for the governor's office in Vermont. We had a number of decision makers there with us, and a whole lot of people just turning out to discuss those same issues that you went over. The basic idea is this: we're laying out this framework. We're looking for people to weigh in, to get involved with these conversations, to really delve into areas that they find most meaningful or most compelling. and to contribute to this discussion and to the development of this rights and democracy framework. So there will be more of those coming.
Aly, any concluding thoughts on your part?
I'm excited to continue these town-level conversations that we've been having all over Vermont and New Hampshire, and plan to continue. And I hope folks will turn out to town meeting on Tuesday to raise these issues as well and consider how you can work them out at the local level.
And a few announcements as we wind down our time here. For folks who might have missed it, Rights and Democracy has endorsed Senator Sanders running for president, and you might want to join us Tuesday night at what I'm pretty certain will be a victory party. I think he has, in the polls say he has about 83% of the vote. The place will be announced, but it'll be the place to be in Burlington. We know that. So that's this Tuesday, March 1st. Other upcoming important event in there's going to be a Black Lives Matter march in St. Albans, and that's going to be at 1 p.m. on the 27th. That is this Saturday. That's right, this Saturday, 1 p.m. Black Lives Matter march in St. Albans. We're holding a press conference on our Raise Up Vermont campaign. We're going to invite folks there for a press conference that will be held on 11 a.m. on Wednesday, March 9th at the State House. That'll be in the Cedar Creek room there. So until next month, stay strong. Hope people get engaged with Rights and Democracy. Again, you can go to our website, radvt.org. Our program, our show next month, that'll be the fourth Friday of March. I think that's probably like the 27th of March. We'll be on our campaign, the Raise Up Vermont campaign. And that is a campaign, I mean, very briefly, that's a campaign about raising up the working and living conditions of working Vermonters. Making sure that people are paid livable wages and that, in fact, we can win work with dignity.
There's more on energy democracy, too. If you look at the New Economy Week, there was a webinar in November, so people can check that out. Just do a search. New Economy Week, energy democracy, what is it and why does it matter?
New Economy Week, energy democracy. And that's going to be when again?
It happened in November, but you can still find the webinar. And it's a great introduction to a lot of good work happening across the country.
Thanks, and I really thank you for bringing in this discussion of energy democracy. It's an important part of the jobs, justice, and climate framework, which many people leave out, and otherwise we're kind of stuck with this divisive way of, is this going to be a just transition? Is it a transition that brings us together and unites communities, or is it one that's in fact divisive?
That's it. Thank you, Traven.
Aly, thanks so much for joining us, and Matthew, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. And stay strong. Take it easy, but take it.